They say it takes a certain kind of person to head toward a planet like Venus. They're not wrong. You have to be able to face down hostile conditions and accept the cold fact that survival is no guarantee. But I always had that streak, the willingness to push into the unknown, no matter how ugly the odds. And for a man like me, Venus might as well have been a paradise. I'd been briefed dozens of times over the past few months about the particulars of this mission. The Sentinel, our orbital research station around Venus, was state-of-the-art, equipped with everything we needed to study the mysteries of the thick clouds below. But nothing had prepared me for the news that life, actual life, was emerging from Venus's upper atmosphere. I stood in the docking bay of the Sentinel, suited up in a layer of reinforced composite and metal designed to keep me alive in the face of anything the planet could throw at us. We didn't have to worry about the scorching heat down on the surface, but even here, 50 kilometers above the inferno, the atmosphere was no friendlier. Acidic clouds of sulfuric gas, high levels of radiation, Venus seemed to resist life on principle. So what was this thing, crawling up from that cauldron, stubbornly clinging to the acidic layers? Our suits were thick, the helmets fitted with reinforced visors and a high-resolution HUD display inside. It felt like I was inside a metal cocoon, sealed off from the world. A small readout in the lower corner fed me every relevant metric: oxygen, temperature, even my own heart rate, which I realized was spiking just a bit higher than I wanted to admit. But I reminded myself that this was science, not some half-baked adventure story. The protocols, the equipment, it was all reliable, proven to withstand environments far more lethal than this. Across from me, Dr. Stanton ran one last diagnostic check on the containment canister, a bulky device designed to secure any biospecimen we collected. Stanton was a no-nonsense type, far more pragmatic than the rest of us, and I appreciated his thoroughness. The device itself looked like a high-tech bear trap, lined with electromagnetic seals and a small observation window reinforced with more layers than I could count. It was supposed to contain anything dangerous, with multiple redundancies to ensure nothing breached the seals. Even the idea of something breaking out was laughable. "You good?" Stanton's voice crackled over the comm. "Good as I'll ever be," I replied, running a final check on my equipment. O2 at full, filters optimal. My HUD flickered briefly as I glanced down at the controls on my wrist. I could feel the hum of the suit's climate control, a faint vibration that was both comforting and ominous in its constancy. We were suited up to the gills with tools and sensors, infrared readers, radiation shields, and signal interference detectors. I trusted the technology. The suits and instruments had been tested countless times. If anything went wrong out there, it wouldn't be due to our gear. Our descent craft, the Harpy, was a small, hardened vessel that looked like a chrome bullet with wings, built to slice through the denser layers of Venus's atmosphere. I climbed inside and strapped in, feeling the slight resistance of the suit against the reinforced seat. Every inch of the Harpy was cramped and functional, walls lined with diagnostic panels and emergency controls, each feature stripped of any semblance of comfort. Stanton slid into the seat beside me, muttering under his breath as he checked the readouts. As we began the descent, I couldn't help but stare out the small, reinforced window as the Sentinel's docking bay slid away. The vastness of space faded behind us, replaced by the thick yellow clouds of Venus's upper atmosphere. Through the layers of acid and haze, I could see a strange, shifting form moving up from below, like a shadow in the soup. The life form, our target. Our descent was steady, the craft shuddering as we passed through pockets of dense gas. I glanced at the controls, where a sensor readout flashed with increasingly erratic data. The specimen was large, much larger than we'd anticipated. What I'd imagined as a cluster of microbial forms looked more like an amorphous shifting mass, swirling and writhing in ways I hadn't expected. The Harpy's exterior sensors started picking up fluctuations, unusual energy spikes, and radio-like pulses that seemed to come from the life form. I leaned forward, studying the feed as the data flickered across my HUD. The signals didn't align with anything in our database. They were chaotic, erratic, but there was a pattern to it, like a sound trying to form words through static. "We're picking up something strange from it," I said, trying to sound detached, though I felt a creeping unease. "Could be an atmospheric reaction, maybe interference. Still, keep an eye on it." Stanton nodded, frowning as he monitored the data feed. "It's too structured for interference, almost like some kind of frequency modulation." He didn't need to say it outright. The signals coming from the life form were far too deliberate to be natural, at least in the sense we understood. But any interpretation beyond that was wishful thinking. We were here to gather, not to speculate. As we neared the target, I activated the containment canister, aligning it to extend from the harpy's underbelly. Through the feed on my HUD, I watched it reach down toward the life form like a mechanical arm. The atmosphere was thick with acid clouds, but the canister's sensors cut through it, transmitting a clear visual. The creature was massive, writhing and curling, with bizarre extensions that appeared to ripple as it sensed our approach. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Lowering containment now. Steady, steady. The canister touched the edge of the life form, and immediately the sensors picked up rapid movements. It responded instantly, like it had been waiting for us. Extensions lashed out, brushing against the metallic surface of the canister, as if testing it. My heart hammered as I watched the readout. The extensions twisted around the edges, pressing close, almost clinging to the device. "What the hell?" I whispered, feeling my throat tighten. The life form appeared to fluctuate, its form shifting, growing denser as it attached itself to the canister. Stanton's voice broke through, tight with tension. "It's reacting to the containment, almost like it knows what we're doing." "Just get the sample," I replied, forcing myself to keep calm. "Secure it. Whatever this thing is, we're not leaving without it." The canister's magnetic seals activated, and I watched the life form compress, folding itself into the container with a sluggish, almost reluctant movement. Once it was inside, the seals closed with a faint click. A reading flashed across my HUD. Containment secure. But even as I let out a slow breath, something felt wrong. The life form wasn't struggling, wasn't resisting. If anything, it seemed almost docile, like it had decided to let us take it. I activated the feed from the containment unit, watching it from the small observation window. The life form moved slowly, pressing against the glass as if watching me back. I shook my head, willing myself to stay professional. We were scientists. This was what we'd come here for. As we began our ascent back toward the Sentinel, the faintest hum was coming through my comm. I tried to adjust the settings, but the signal stayed. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Stanton glanced at me, eyes narrowed. "Hear what?" But I could see it on his face. He heard it too. The ascent back to the Sentinel was supposed to be routine. We'd done it dozens of times before, but this time, I felt a strange tension in the cockpit. The life form moved inside the containment chamber below, shifting like it was adjusting to its new confines. I could almost feel it through the walls of the harpy, a faint, unsteady vibration, like an insect trapped in a jar. We'd secured the sample. That should have been enough to ease the tension, but that hum on the comm still buzzed in the background, steady and unsettling. I adjusted my suit's audio filters, trying to drown it out. But the rhythm remained, a maddening noise, like a heartbeat in the static. Every time I tried to ignore it, it seemed to creep back into my awareness. Stanton's face was drawn, his eyes fixed on the containment chamber's monitor. "We're getting signal spikes from it," he muttered, frowning. "That shouldn't be happening. It's just biological matter. It shouldn't be active." When we docked back at the Sentinel, I barely had time to unstrap before Stanton was already moving, activating the clamps and powering down the harpy. The crew was waiting in the airlock, suited up. They'd been watching the data feed, and I knew they'd seen the same erratic patterns. As we transferred the containment unit from the harpy to the main lab, I kept my eyes on the specimen. It was still shifting, its form pressing against the reinforced glass. The closer I looked, the more I thought I saw faint movements within. Small shifts, like it was exploring its confines, testing its boundaries. Dr. Megan Jennings, our biochemist, leaned over my shoulder, her face illuminated by the lab's white lights. She looked fascinated. "This is extraordinary," she whispered. "Nothing we've studied should survive in those conditions, let alone respond to containment." I shrugged, trying to keep it clinical. "Extraordinary or not, let's keep it contained and document everything. Standard procedure." Megan nodded, but I could tell her mind was already elsewhere, captivated by the possibilities of this discovery. I wasn't sure if I felt the same. Once we had the specimen secured in the main lab, we set up a series of scanners around the containment chamber. Stanton and Megan started running preliminary diagnostics, feeding data from the specimen into the system. But as soon as they activated the sensors, the readings went wild. The signals were coming in at frequencies that didn't make any sense, modulating in irregular patterns, jumping across wavelengths as if it were intentionally avoiding detection. Stanton cursed under his breath, recalibrating the system, but each time he tried to lock onto a stable frequency, the signals seemed to slip away, like the specimen was evading us. "What the hell is it doing?" I muttered, watching as the data spiked and crashed in erratic bursts. "It's learning," Megan whispered. I shot her a look, but she didn't back down. Her eyes were fixed on the monitor, captivated. There was a strong sense that the life form was studying us, gathering data, learning our patterns just as we were trying to learn its patterns. Then, through the comm system, that hum returned. I adjusted my headset, straining to make out the pattern. Stanton picked up on it too, his fingers hovering over the controls. "It's matching frequencies," he said slowly. "Every time we try to scan it, it's sending something back. But it's not random. Look at the modulation. It's calculating." I frowned, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Calculating. That wasn't a word we used lightly. And as I watched the signal shift in response to our scans, I felt the first real pang of fear. We were 3 hours into the analysis when the first malfunction hit. Megan's console beeped, showing a red error message across the screen. "Containment field interference," she murmured. "The specimen is emitting low-range frequencies that are disrupting the field. This shouldn't be possible." "What do you mean?" "I mean that it's acting like it knows the containment field is there," she replied. "It's broadcasting in frequencies that specifically interfere with our equipment." "Stanton," I called. "Can we isolate that signal? I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." Stanton nodded. He filtered through the interference, adjusting the frequency range until the signal's cadence was clearer. But as the sound sharpened, my skin crawled. There was a rhythm to it, something disturbingly close to human speech. Megan's face went pale as she listened. "It's trying to mimic us." The realization hit hard. This wasn't interference. The life form was adapting, picking up on our communication systems, learning our frequencies. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching as the signal shifted into patterns that were more and more familiar. Hours passed, and the containment unit's glass became clouded with condensation, as though the life form were reacting to its confinement. It pressed against the glass, extensions stretching, flattening, almost as if searching for a way out. "We need to keep this contained," I said to Stanton and Megan. "If it's capable of adapting to our systems, we can't let it access our main network. We have to keep it isolated from our communication channels." Stanton nodded, but his face was tense. Megan looked shaken, her eyes fixed on the specimen as if entranced. Suddenly, a voice came over the comm, distorted and garbled. "Containment. Breach. Imminent." I froze, glancing over at Megan, who looked just as stunned. The message was coming from our internal comms system, but no one else was on the channel. We exchanged a look, and I saw the same fear mirrored in her eyes. Stanton scrambled to check the containment seals. "No breaches detected," he muttered. "But I don't understand how that message—" He trailed off as the comms crackled again. This time the voice was clearer, each word slow, drawn out, chillingly precise. "Containment. Breach. Imminent. A cold realization settled over me. The life form was communicating, mimicking us, trying to warn or maybe threaten. I couldn't tell which was worse. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The hum stayed with me, even when I closed my eyes, like a pressure building in my skull. In the darkness of my quarters, it twisted into strange patterns, like fractured memories trying to resurface. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the faint buzz of the ventilation system. The morning briefing was tense. Stanton looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot, and Megan hadn't touched her breakfast. We gathered around the central console, watching the containment feed, the specimen's dark mass filling the observation window like a sluggish, swirling fog. It was still, silent, almost as if it were biding its time. But it didn't last. Halfway through our briefing, the lights went out, plunging us into a dim red glow. Every screen on the console blinked to black, save for a single line of text scrawled across the primary monitor. Containment field disengaged. "What the hell?" I muttered, my pulse hammering. Stanton's face drained of color. "That's, impossible. I triple-checked the seals last night. There's no way." We moved as one, heading to the lab, the hallways eerily silent save for that incessant hum. When we reached the containment chamber, my stomach dropped. The glass observation window was smeared with a thin, dark substance, a glistening film clinging to the surface, and inside, nothing. The life form was gone. "Where is it?" Megan whispered, her voice shaking. She took a step forward, reaching out as if to touch the glass, but I grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Don't. It could still be in here somewhere," I said, my voice low and hard. I felt a chill settle in my gut, the hairs on my neck prickling as I scanned the lab. Every shadow seemed to twist and ripple, alive with hidden movement. We checked every corner, every crevice, but there was no sign of it. No trail, no residue, just that thin, oily film on the glass. It was as if it had melted through the containment field and slipped into the walls, into the very structure of the station itself. Every few seconds, the hum would spike, sending tremors through the metal floor. And each time it happened, I saw Stanton wince, pressing his hands against his temples. It was like the sound was worming its way into our heads, digging in, becoming part of us. The station's comm system activated. A garbled voice whispered through the speakers, half-formed words and distorted syllables, like a broken radio signal trying to emulate speech. My name was in there, distorted and mangled, followed by Megan's, then Stanton's. "It's in the comms," Stanton said, his voice shaking. It's in our systems. That's how it got out. It must have disabled the containment field remotely." "That's absurd," I replied, though the fear in my voice betrayed me. "It's a life form, a mass of organic material. There's no way it should have this kind of control." But I knew better. This thing wasn't just reacting to us, it was understanding us, mimicking us, using our systems as if they were its own. And now, without any containment, it was loose on the station, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting. We spread out, splitting up to check each section of the station. As I reached the storage bay, a sharp, high-pitched screech erupted from the comms, stabbing into my ears. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the sound drilled into my skull, like an animal scream mixed with static. I glanced up and saw Megan down the corridor, her face twisted in pain as she pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise. The screech finally stopped, leaving a throbbing silence in its wake. My ears rang, the pain dull but constant, and when I opened my eyes, I saw something dark, something wet and slick, glistening on the floor just ahead of me. A trail. I followed the dark smear down the hallway. The trail led to the storage room, an unused space filled with equipment we hadn't touched in months. I reached the door, fingers hovering over the control panel, and hesitated, a sick feeling pooling in my gut. But I had to know. I punched the code and the door slid open. The smell hit me first, a thick, cloying scent like rotting vegetation mixed with sulfur. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything was covered in a thick, viscous substance. a dark, slimy film that shimmered like oil on water. It clung to every surface, dripping from the ceiling in long, slim extensions that swayed with a sickening rhythm. The life form had spread itself out, multiplying, branching into countless slimy threads that wound together, clinging to the walls in dense clusters. A high-pitched whine began building in the room, faint at first, but quickly intensifying, getting sharper, cutting into my head like a knife. I doubled over, pressing my hands to my ears, but it was useless. The sound was everywhere, inside my skull, eroding my thoughts. Megan stumbled into the room behind me, her eyes wide with horror as she took in the scene. Her voice came out as a strangled whisper. "It's multiplying." She was right. The life form was reproducing, creating more of itself, an intricate web of writhing shapes that seemed to expand by the second. The thick black slime oozed down the walls, congealing in pools on the floor, and I could see faint shapes moving within it, shifting in time with the hum. Then the comms flared to life again, filling the air with a distorted, garbled voice. It wasn't a hum anymore, it was words or something close to it. The sound was deep, guttural, like a creature struggling to form human speech. I could barely make it out, but the intent was clear. "You will listen." The words sent a jolt of fear through me. This thing wasn't just mindlessly spreading, it was aware, and it was communicating. Stanton's voice crackled through my headset, frantic. "I'm losing control of the station's systems. The life form it's overriding everything. Communications, power, life support, it's everywhere." The lights dimmed again, and this time, they didn't come back on. We were plunged into near darkness, save for the faint glow from the emergency lights reflecting off the slime-coated walls, casting everything in a ghastly, sickly hue. I felt my chest tighten as the temperature dropped, a chill settling in the air. "We have to stop it," Megan said, her voice shaking. "If it reaches the core systems, it could—" She didn't finish, but I knew what she was thinking. If the life form took full control of the station, it could turn it into anything it wanted. In the dark, I could see the shapes creeping across the floor, stretching toward us, inching forward like predatory vines. They moved slowly but persistently, leaving a trail of glistening residue in their wake. I backed away, pulling Megan with me, my heart pounding in my throat. We had to contain it somehow. Another high-pitched screech ripped through the air, sharper and louder than before. I dropped to the ground, clutching my head as the sound tore into me, my vision blurring with pain. I could hear Megan's scream beside me, but it was lost in the noise, drowned out by the piercing shriek. I forced myself to look up, my eyes watering from the pain, and saw the life form writhing, thrashing as if in response to our presence. The screech died down, replaced by that awful hum, louder than ever. And then the comms crackled, the distorted voice filling the room once more. "You brought us here." We stumbled back, barely able to process what we'd just seen. The life form had turned the storage room into a twisted hive, a mass of writhing tissue that moved with unsettling awareness. It was no longer a specimen. It was a presence, an entity that had embedded itself into the station's framework. By the time we regrouped, it was clear we'd lost control of the station. The life form's network had spread from the storage bay, winding through every corridor and vent, even breaching the walls to invade the station's core systems. Thick, viscous slime clung to every surface, and the air was thick with that rotten, sulfuric smell, suffocating and unnatural. It was everywhere now, almost alive in the walls, vibrating, reaching. The hum had transformed too. What once felt like a steady pulse had turned into a garbled, almost spoken rhythm, each beat distorted, just shy of language. It didn't feel like an attack anymore. There was something about it, a pattern that hinted at something beyond mindless destruction. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, the sheer horror of it made it hard to think. "Megan, Stanton," I whispered through the comm, barely able to tear my eyes from the sight in front of us. "We have to get out. There's nothing left to study here. We need to abandon the Sentinel before this thing consumes everything." But Stanton, his face ghostly pale under the emergency lights, just shook his head. "Look at it," he murmured. "It's not trying to kill us. I think it's trying to learn." As we crept through the main corridor toward the escape pods, the hum felt almost like a mournful chant now. It was layered, warped, and I felt my stomach churn as I realized I could pick out words or pieces of words mixed into the garbled noise. Fragments of our own voices echoed back, names and commands it must have picked up during our frantic attempts to contain it. It wasn't an attack, it was mimicry. As if sensing us, the organism began to retract, pulling away from the walls and converging at the far end of the corridor. We watched in silent horror as the mass collected, shifting and coiling into something that resembled a figure. Two stretched arms, a misshapen torso, a face that was little more than a warped patch of dark slime with indentations where eyes and a mouth should be. It was hideous, twisted and barely holding a form, its skin bubbling and shifting as if struggling to maintain the shape. And yet, there was a disturbing familiarity to it, as if it were trying to look human. "Megan," I heard Stanton whisper, his voice trembling. "Do you see that? It's trying to look like us." I forced myself to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. The life form stood, swaying slightly, its head tilting in a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. I took a step forward, my heart hammering in my chest, and the creature's head turned, following my movement with those dark, hollow indentations. "Can you understand us?" I asked. The creature's mouth twisted, gaping open as it tried to imitate a response. It emitted a garbled, guttural noise, a broken imitation of speech. Then it shifted, the shape of its head twitching as though struggling to remember something. And finally, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 overlapping whispers, it managed a single, warped word. "Help!" The word tore through me, a strange, heartbreaking blend of pity and horror. I felt my mind reel as I processed what it was asking. Help? This thing, this monstrosity, was asking for help. Its form continued to distort and twist, parts of it bubbling out of place, reforming, falling apart again. It was like it was trying to hold itself together, but the complexity of the human shape was beyond it. I felt something shift in me, an instinct to run, fight, anything, but I forced myself to stay. "Megan," I murmured, maybe it thinks this is the way to communicate. It's trying to understand us." The creature's head jerked toward us, its hollow, distorted eyes searching, pleading. The air around us filled with that high-pitched hum again, each wave getting sharper, more desperate. I could feel it piercing through me, rattling my skull like a cry that only deepened its hopelessness. "Join!" the creature's voice whispered. Fragments of our own voices layered in its attempt. "Join you." It staggered toward us, its movements unsteady as though hoping to close the gap, to bridge the chasm between its world and ours. The arms reached forward, trembling as if to touch, to feel some connection. But even in my pity, I couldn't move. I couldn't let it touch me. The sight of it was too grotesque, too utterly wrong. It paused, the arms twitching, waiting. And then, as if sensing the rejection, the creature let its hand fall, collapsing back into the shadows, its body twisting and rippling as it sank against the wall. The hum softened, almost like a sigh, and it curled into itself, defeated. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, the horror mingling with a pity so sharp it hurt. This thing, whatever it was, had only wanted to understand us, to be part of us. But it would never belong. We hurried to the escape pods, every step infused with the lifeform's last attempt to reach out. It hadn't attacked. It hadn't tried to destroy us. It had only tried to understand us, to become something it could never be. We secured ourselves in the pods, Megan's face pale and drawn as she powered up the systems. I kept my gaze forward, unable to shake the image of that thing, hunched in the corridor, watching us with those pleading eyes. As the pods detached from the station, I looked back one last time through the viewport. The Sentinel was shrouded in a faint glow, coated in dark, glistening patches of the lifeform clinging to its frame like a thick layer of slime. It was still no longer spreading or shifting, as if it had accepted its place there, alone in the dark, far from any world that could ever understand it. As we sped away, the hum faded, replaced by the silence of space. I leaned back, trying to let go of the horror, but a familiar noise crackled through the pod's comms. The lifeform's voice, broken, distorted, drifting through the static. "Join you." The signal faded, and I felt a hollow ache settle in my chest. We had left it behind, alone in the dark, with nothing but fragments of human voices echoing in its mind. A creature forever trying to understand, to reach us, but doomed to remain on the outside, rejected, a twisted shadow of humanity's image. In the end, it wasn't the life form that haunted me. It was the knowledge that we had crossed paths with something that had wanted nothing more than to connect, and we'd turned our backs, leaving it to drift, misunderstood and forsaken, forever reaching into the void. It was a fate worse than death. And, as the stars blurred past, I couldn't help but wonder if we had truly escaped, or if, in some strange, twisted way, it had finally joined us. The journey back to Earth passed in a blur, months blending together in the darkness of space. We were silent for most of it, each of us weighed down by the events on the Sentinel, haunted by memories of the life form that we'd left behind. I don't remember feeling relieved to be heading home, only empty, as if a part of myself had stayed behind, drifting in the cold silence of space alongside that creature. When we finally touched down on Earth, I felt an overwhelming sense of disconnection. The world seemed too bright, too alive, too far removed from the grim isolation of the Sentinel. Earth's officials and scientists greeted us with the same detached professionalism I'd once valued in myself. The debriefing sessions were thorough, nearly exhaustive. We were encouraged to recount every detail. The moment we'd encountered the life form, the signals, the containment breach, its attempts to mimic us. Each word left my mouth dry and mechanical, as if I were recounting someone else's nightmare. They kept us in isolation for weeks after the initial debriefing, under the pretext of monitoring for any signs of contamination. But it was clear they didn't truly understand what we'd encountered. After the quarantine period, we were finally granted extended leave. A year off, more time than I'd ever had away from duty. Some of us spent it in therapy, others in solitude. I tried to leave it behind, to bury the memory of that dark, shifting mass and its haunting words. But no matter how far I ran, I could still feel its presence, lingering in my mind, like an unwanted shadow. When the year ended, I was given a new assignment, back in orbit, this time aboard the International Space Station. They assured me it would be different from the Sentinel, that I'd be in familiar territory with nothing but the usual protocols and scientific observations. Routine work, they said, a break from hazardous assignments. After everything I'd been through, the idea of a simple orbital mission sounded almost like a relief. The first month passed with nothing but the endless view of Earth rolling beneath me. There was a sort of peace to the predictability, the repetitive tasks, the comforting normalcy of it all. I allowed myself to believe that the events of the Sentinel were finally behind me, locked away in the depths of space where they belonged. One night, as I was performing a routine systems check, a faint blip sounded on the comm system. Just a stray transmission, I thought. Interference. I continued my work, ignoring the occasional static crackle that passed through the station's internal network. Join you. I froze, my hand hovering over the console, a cold dread filling my chest. The words echoed in my mind, each syllable like a shock running through me, unlocking memories I'd buried deep, memories I had wanted to forget. My heart pounded as I tried to dismiss it, to convince myself that it was a mistake, interference from another satellite, a misreading. But the signal persisted, each wave matching the rhythm of the life form's hum, the sound that had haunted me long after I left the Sentinel. I took a deep breath, looking around the small cabin of the ISS. Nothing had changed. Everything was as it should be. But out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark. a faint outline against the backdrop of space. I turned, feeling my breath hitch, and moved toward the observation window, bracing myself against the metal frame. My eyes searched the blackness beyond, scanning the endless expanse for the source of that strange shadow. In the distance, a vast, dark mass, shifting and rippling, floated toward the earth. The blood drained from my face as I realized what I was looking at. It was the life form. But it was no longer the small, confined creature we'd left behind on the Sentinel. This was something far greater. It had grown, its form a massive, undulating blob stretching out in every direction, its surface glistening in the faint light like liquid shadow. It was larger than the ISS, its shape constantly shifting, twisting with eerie fluidity. It moved with purpose, drawing closer to Earth, and I felt a primal fear grip me, deeper than anything I'd felt aboard the Sentinel. The creature's mass hovered just beyond the station, shifting like a dark ocean in the void. I watched, frozen, as parts of its surface rippled, tiny threads of it extending outward, curling towards the ISS. The movement was deliberate, calculated, as if it were reaching out, attempting to bridge the gap between us. It was so close now that I could make out faint shapes forming along its surface, shadows resembling eyes, mouths, distorted human-like faces, all flickering and disappearing in an endless cycle, like it was cycling through images it had seen. Fragments of us. Join you. The words came again, louder this time, resonating through the comms in a way that felt almost physical, vibrating through the station. I clutched the frame, my knuckles white, trying to understand, to make sense of it. It was speaking, using pieces of the language it had learned from us, trying to communicate, but there was something more to it, something deeper, almost like longing. And that's when it struck me. The life form wasn't just trying to reach us, it was trying to become us. Somehow, in the isolation of space, in the echo of its confinement, it had latched onto humanity, desperate to connect, to belong. It had followed us, growing, evolving, becoming this immense, indescribable thing, all for the sake of understanding us, of being part of us. I tore my eyes away, my heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the crew scrambled, shouting questions, trying to understand what was happening. But I could barely hear them. All I could focus on was the life form outside, watching as its vast, rippling surface pressed closer to the station, filling the entire view. "Is it going to attack us?" someone asked, voice tinged with panic. I couldn't answer. I didn't know. The life form's intentions were a mystery, its mind an alien landscape we could never truly understand. But I could feel its presence, an overwhelming, suffocating sense of something ancient and unknowable. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It was other, a creature caught between worlds, between shapes, trying to find a place it would never truly fit. The life form had come so far, for this impossible dream of unity, of joining a world it could never belong to, and as it lingered there, shifting and rippling outside the ISS, I couldn't shake the feeling that some connections, once made, can never truly be severed.